It's time once again for Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
I'm Chaz Licciardello.
After the week when peaceful Black Lives Matter demonstrations continued across America and indeed around the world, and a funeral was held for George Floyd, whose death at the hands of police last month triggered the protests, President Trump has now vowed to improve police training and law enforcement practices while condemning those who've suggested defunding or dismantling police forces could be the answer.
In recent days, there's been vigorous discussion about how to ensure fairness, equality, and justice for all of our people. Unfortunately, there are some trying to stoke division and to push an extreme agenda which we won't go for, that will produce only more poverty, more crime, more suffering. This includes radical efforts to defund, dismantle, and disband the police. They want to get rid of the police forces. They actually want to get rid of it.
Yeah, of course, senior Democrats can't run fast enough away from the idea of defunding the police. Biden has just this week put out an op-ed where he's actually said he's going to give the police $300 million more for community policing. So I don't think that's a real threat there. But Trump needs to come up with at least some decent kinds of proposals to deal with the issue of criminal justice discrimination, though, because he touched on it, but he needs more than that, I think, because America is moving rapidly away from him on that particular question. If you look at the polls, after the Eric Garner death in 2014, only 33% of Americans said that police were more likely to use excessive force against African Americans, and 26% of white people agreed, only 26%. And now, 57% of people say police are more likely to use force against African Americans, and 49% of white people agree. This is becoming a dangerous issue for Trump if he doesn't take it seriously.
Yeah, certainly the power of us all literally seeing that footage. This is no longer a matter of opinion. We all saw it, which has given it that potency.
I also think it didn't help, even though this wasn't black people, it didn't help that the police kept on attacking the media.
Yep.
Like they all have cameras, and we saw like 50 times the police attacking the media in a few weeks, and yeah.
Yeah, there's certainly been a pretty profound shift, just seeing so many examples of police brutality in response to the protests as well. And there have been some really interesting developments in response to the protests in the last week or so. NASCAR has now banned the Confederate flag from all of its racetracks, prompting at least one driver to quit. The NFL has apologised for not supporting those players who were taking a knee during the national anthem to protest police violence, although Colin Kaepernick still hasn't got a job. HBO has taken down Gone with the Wind to add a new expert introduction explaining why its depictions of happy slaves in cotton fields and Mammy in the house is offensive to many, and it was itself a part of the rewriting, the whitewashing of history. Meanwhile, we have seen legislators looking at responses that they can make as well to these protests. There was that sweeping justice in policing bill introduced by House Democrats during the week. Nancy Pelosi also has called for the statues of Confederates to be removed from the US Capitol building. You didn't know there were any. There are 100 statues around the Capitol building. Every state gets to choose 2 statues. Now, in the case of Alabama, one of them is Helen Keller. Not a lot of people would argue with that. The other, a Confederate general who fought for the pro-slavery states. And this is kind of the problem with a lot of these states. They've got some really problematic people in this Hall of Honour. Elizabeth Warren, Democratic Senator, has also introduced a bill this week to remove the names of Confederate generals from American military bases, things like Fort Hood and Fort Bragg. Well, President Trump doesn't like that idea.
Seriously failed presidential candidate Senator Elizabeth Pocahontas Warren just announced an amendment on the renaming of many of our legendary military bases from which we trained to win 2 world wars. Hopefully our great Republican senators won't fall for this.
So President Trump talking about wanting to preserve the rich military history of all of this. But on that, let me just point out Fort Bragg. It's been called Fort Bragg since, I think, about the First World War. But it was named Fort Bragg basically as a sop to southern states. The US Army wanted the physical land to build bases, including Fort Hood and others. So the way that they got the then basically southern sort of post-Reconstruction, pretty racist democratic governments in those states. To give them land grants was to say, we're going to name it Fort Bragg after General Braxton Bragg, who was actually one of the most incompetent Confederate generals. He lost Georgia, basically lost the Civil War. He was a complete and utter dud. But they allowed him to be named that way as a part of this whole lost cause kind of historical revisionism. But, you know, it's ridiculous that as a part of what was essentially a financial transaction and a sop to those sort of, you know, hurt Southern feelings about the Civil War, that they allowed this sort of stuff to be done at the time.
Yeah, the thing for me about the whole renaming thing, in fact, well, let's start with the renaming. We've covered a few things before there. This happens all the time. The renaming things. Every 20 years they rename every stand in the SCG and the MCG.
Right.
They keep on playing them down.
They rename cities and states and countries.
They rename with Batman or Batman the electorate in Melbourne. No one cared. It's just like, I feel like when you name things in honour of people, it's more for the present.
Yep.
Rather than for 100 years in the future. 100 years in the future, no one cares.
Yeah.
Like, and so I don't think it really matters. I mean, bottom line, I wouldn't care if they kept it. I wouldn't care if they didn't. I feel like that's a decision for the army. So you have ESPA and you have the army secretary saying that they don't mind changing.
Why would the US military be happy to have its bases named after generals who fought against the United States, who left the United States and then fought against it? And the idea that the Confederate flag is somehow American and patriotic. It is the very definition of anti-patriotism.
Well,
it's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's what Petraeus was saying. Petraeus was saying they committed treason.
Yeah, and let's also remember that the erecting of Confederate general statues, of all of these memorials, of the naming of towns, the naming of bases and everything else, this was something that was happening in that period about 50 years after the end of the Civil War, so the 1910s and 20s, where the last of the veterans were dying. There was a whole lot of nostalgia for it. In that post-war period, there had been a little bit like Australia's sort of mythology around Gallipoli. Obviously, Gallipoli, massive defeat, but we were kind of, you know, it was spun into this defeat represented some heroic values on our part. You know, it wasn't just us invading Turkey and getting our backsides kicked and evacuating a few months later. It was like, this is a nation, you know, forming moment. This is the cauldron where Australia became Australia and everything else. That was a national coping mechanism at the time because Australia suffered terrible losses. There was a coping mechanism for the southern states that suffered terrible losses in the lost cause of the Civil War. But the nostalgia that was allowed to be built up around that was more than face-saving. It was about keeping black people down. And every Confederate statue was about keeping black people down and memorialising these generals who fought to retain slavery.
Yeah.
It was all about that. And that's how it should be viewed.
But once again, like you say, it was about politics at the time.
Yeah.
It wasn't about history. These things are never about history. No one walks around from town to town going, oh, that's an interesting, that dog on the tucker box, tell me about that story. No one cares. Yeah. I feel like people who are arguing about, oh, we're going to lose our history if this statue gets pulled down. No, you're not. Yeah. History's in books. It's not in statues.
But that's where something like Gone with the Wind is a part of that narrative, which was to say, actually, there are two arguments post-Civil War from the South. One, it wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights, the states' rights to have slaves, but sure. And then, of course, there was this fiction, which was the happy slaves. And that's the objection that a lot of people have got with Gone with the Wind, is that it actually says these people were better off than they were in Africa because they had jobs and they had housing and they could pick cotton and all this kind of stuff, that was somehow a good thing.
Yeah, see, this for me is different, Gone with the Wind. And the reason why is because a statue or the name of a stand or whatever, or a base, I don't think people go out of their way to find, oh, that base is called that. Whereas people go out of their way to see a movie or to see a TV show. And I don't think you should force people to not be allowed to watch what they want. If it's taken off Netflix, if it's on Netflix, it's not forcing you to watch it. If you want to watch it, it's there. And so I don't like depriving people of options if they want to have a kind of entertainment. What you mentioned when you were talking about the offence that it causes people, that's why you should have a warning. I actually think what HBO is suggesting of doing, which is they're not actually taking it down for good. They're going to bring it back up with a warning at the top. I think that's a great idea.
And as I understand it, an expert historian who's going to reframe, recontextualise it by saying, you know, the mythology of the happy cotton pickers is a part of a destructive myth that justified slavery.
And if you don't want to watch it, you can fast forward through that. Right. Don't make it like the old video warning at the beginning of the video VHS where you have to watch it.
Yeah.
But provide the information, provide the warning. If people want to know about it, it's there. If people would accidentally stumble across it and get offended, then the warning's there. I think that's great. That's what we do for everything else when it's offensive with videos and movies. We have a warning. So I don't know why this wouldn't be the same.
What about the Confederate flag thing? Because I mean that always struck me as very, very strange. And even, you know, going through the South now, you see as many, or at least you did a few years ago, as many Confederate flags flying as you do American flags, and yet, you know, this seems to be, you know, it's still very culturally resonant with Southern white males in particular. That NASCAR has taken this stand now and said we're going to ban this because we believe it's offensive. Is that a reasonable thing to do? I mean, clearly NASCAR wants. There's partly a commercial consideration here. That first they targeted women to get women involved with NASCAR. Now they want African Americans to support NASCAR as well.
I think it's okay to let a private organisation maximise their profits, which is what they're doing.
Yeah. But what about them telling fans you can't turn up and...
That's why they're doing it.
Yeah.
They're doing it because it's a bad look on TV for their advertisers.
Yeah.
And so, I don't have a problem with a private organisation doing that. In the same way as they try to clean up the cricket, or controlling crowd behaviour is a established way of trying to make money. If you're a sporting organisation, and I don't see why we should stop them.
This is turning into an episode of The Drum. I like it though. It's good. Now look, there were some pretty worrying signs this week that America's push to reopen back in May has come at a cost, with a spike in new infections and hospitalisations this week. Despite that though, state leaders are not talking about another shutdown such as we saw in the last few months. President Trump is announcing as well he's returning to the campaign trail with a series of rallies starting in Tulsa, Oklahoma next week. The timing and location of that is raising a few eyebrows, not just for the health reasons obviously, but because June 19 is known as Juneteenth. It commemorates the emancipation of the slaves. And Tulsa, you might recall we did a story on this a year or two ago, it was the scene of a horrendous race massacre in 1921 when white people, including the white police force, attacked what was a very affluent black neighbourhood in Greenwood, Tulsa. It was known as the Black Wall Street. The police literally bombed innocent black civilians, throwing dynamite from biplanes. Hundreds of African Americans were killed as a result of this. And then, of course, there is the risk that with Oklahoma, there's no social distancing there and they could be sitting ducks to COVID-19. Now, is this tone deafness from President Trump, deliberately provocative, I don't careism? What's going on?
Look, I don't know that he's thinking about the race riot from 1921, but he should be thinking about COVID because that is a real issue going forward. And Oklahoma is not the best place at the moment, which I'll get into in a second. Let's go through these numbers. The national trends haven't changed much. That 7-day average for daily deaths is still very slowly falling, but basically every week there's about 6,000 deaths. They're up to 115,000 deaths overall now. Daily new cases is also stuck on its plateau at about 20,000 new cases a day with over 2 million cases overall. But when we go to the states, this is where it gets a bit complicated. There are now 6 states that have qualified to open up according to the federal criteria: Montana, Wisconsin, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. But notice that map has split into 2. The North and Northeast, which used to struggle heaps with COVID, is now mostly green for good or yellow for not bad. But the South and the West is looking very red at the moment. That means trouble. In fact, since the start of June, 14 states and Puerto Rico have recorded their highest ever 7-day average of new coronavirus cases, and they're all in the South or West. Furthermore, in Texas, North and South Carolina, California, Oregon, Arkansas, Mississippi, Utah, and Arizona, there are now an increasing number of patients being hospitalised as well. So let's look at some of those states. Florida, its cases have spiked to an all-time high for them, but their tests are only 4.3% positive. That's not too bad. 10% tends to be the danger mark. California's cases have continued to rise to an all-time high as well. Their hospitalisations have gone up 10% in the last 2 weeks, but their positive testing rate's still low. This is why North Carolina can't host a Republican convention. Look at that. Their cases are rising rapidly. Their positive testing percentages moved from 5% to 7% in the last 2 weeks, and their hospitalisations have doubled in the last month. they're in trouble. So's Texas. They're on a big hike right now as well. Their hospitalizations have gone up 30% in a week to a new high, and their positive testing percentage has risen from 5% to 7% in the last 2 weeks. Finally, the state attracting the headlines is Arizona. Their hospitalizations have doubled in the last month from what was a high to a much bigger high, and their positive testing percentage has risen from 7% to, wait for it, 13% in the last 2 weeks. So Arizona's got some issues, but Nate Silver has made a good point that right now, the spread's medium high in many places, as opposed to super high levels in some places, which it was before. Like New York once had an 11% of its people with an active infection, 5% were infected in New Orleans, Boston, and Detroit. But now, the infection rates are more like 0.6% or 0.4% in these southern states. The big difference is that now there's no lockdown slowing the spread. It's where it might go in the next few weeks, that's the question. And I don't think lockdown's coming back, John.
No.
Back in April, 30% of independents in Pennsylvania favoured reopening the state. Now it's 48%. Republicans moved even further to 78% favouring reopening. And this might be why. Only 66% of independents now trust the medical experts, and only 35% of Republicans trust the medical experts. My mind goes back to last week, John, when we talked about those 1,200 health professionals that were suggesting the George Floyd protests were worth risking despite COVID. That might not have been a good idea in hindsight.
Yeah, well, we're going to see, I guess, in the next 2 weeks when we get to that 1 month after Memorial Day, when a lot of Americans got out and about, if this spike in admissions inevitably turns into a spike in deaths, will we see that sort of shift back towards people going back to self-isolating, particularly during the summer vacation period in the United States? Or are they going to, as the President suggested back in February, ride it like a cowboy on the second wave?
Yeah.
This week, though, Chaz, when it comes to economic news, the Federal Reserve kind of confirmed what we've known since February. The US economy is in a recession, and they predict that unemployment would still be just below 10% by the end of the year. The markets, though, have been surprisingly resilient throughout of all of this. Earlier on in the week, the S&P 500 actually got into positive territory for the year, so it was back above where it had been before the pandemic. Wall Street did take a tumble on Friday morning, Australian time, Thursday, in the United States, when investors started to ponder upon those new case and hospital admission numbers and rather lost their mojo. But the big news was the unemployment data for the month of May. It was expected to climb into the high teens, if not the low 20-something% range, but actually came in at 13.3%, which surprised a lot of people, although some people, like friend of the show, former Democratic presidential candidate Governor Howard Dean, smelled a bit of a rat, claiming that the Trump folks fudged the figures and that the real unemployment rate was between 17 and 19%, although economists point out that even that higher figure would still represent something of a decline. So is there skullduggery afoot, Chaz?
No.
Okay, good.
Should I elaborate?
Yeah, what was so because there was some fine print in the Department of Labor statistics reports that had people going, hang on, they're undercounting this, they're miscounting people as having jobs when they haven't got jobs.
Yeah, look, basically, when workers are temporarily laid off, like most of these workers have been, they're supposed to say on their survey that they fill out that they're unemployed. But a few million workers think, well, I'm still attached to my employer, so I don't count as unemployed. So they filled out not unemployed. So the unemployment percentage ends up being lower than it should be. That's what they're referring to. But that's not a fudging. There's no way that they fudged it for Trump's benefit. The department that puts these figures together has 2,800 bureaucrats there and one political employee. If that one political employee tried to mess with the figures, it would clearly be found out and it would leak. So there's no way that's fudged. In fact, if we look at the official unemployment figures for the last 3 months, then look at what they would be, you'll see if they had filled out their forms correctly, the unemployment rate would have just dropped 3% just now, rather than 1%. It would have helped Trump. So rack off Howard Dean. While I'm dealing with myths though, you may have seen the president made a big fool of himself when he announced those jobs figures.
Hopefully George is looking down right now and saying there's a great thing that's happening for our country. There's a great day for him. It's a great day for everybody.
Whoa, how about that? Politico noted that Trump touted the improved unemployment numbers in the Rose Garden and said that they marked a great day for George Floyd. The New York Daily News went a little further, saying Trump says George Floyd is looking down from heaven because of the marginal unemployment drop. It's a great day for him, Trump said. The new jobs report hopefully brings comfort to Floyd, who died after a white Minneapolis cop dug a knee in his neck. Well, they sure showed him, John, except it wasn't true. Fake news, look at this.
Equal justice under the law must mean that every American receives equal treatment in every encounter with law enforcement, regardless of race, color, gender, or creed. They have to receive fair treatment from law enforcement. They have to receive it. We all saw what happened last week. We can't let that happen. Hopefully George is looking down right now and saying, this is a great thing that's happening for our country. This is a great day for him. It's a great day for everybody. This is a great day for everybody. This is a great, great day in terms of equality.
So he was talking about police reform, not unemployment. Bad news, bad. But back to those figures. That was the biggest monthly gain in jobs since 1939. So that's great. But look where all those job gains came from. Temporary layoffs, and there are plenty more of them to go. But meanwhile, permanent layoffs are still rising. Now, those permanent layoffs are up to 3 million, which you have to go back to 2015 to match. So there is a big permanent unemployment rate slowly brewing underneath all these temporary jobs returning. Also, these jobs are only returning in certain areas. Restaurants, dentists, clothing stores, general merch stores, specialty contractors, auto dealers, laundry services and repairs. The other 85% of the economy is still going nowhere. No new jobs there. And just to ram home how much further they've got to go, this is where the jobs were going up till now. That's the recession, and here's the comeback. It's a long road back yet, John.
Well, let's take a look at the state of the US economy right now. We're joined by Michael Strain. He is the Director of Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Michael Strain, thanks for joining us for a Fireside Chat.
Thanks for having me.
So can you explain this for us? The market has been up, although it was down a little bit this week. The unemployment rate has been up, but it's coming down as well. So how would you sum up the current state of the US economy?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that there's really no debate or question that the U.S. economy is in terrible shape. The unemployment rate in the United States right now is 1/3 higher than it ever was in the Great Recession, 1/3 higher than the peak rate during the Great Recession that began in 2008. The loss of GDP that the economy experienced in the first quarter is dramatic. The second quarter is going to see historic rates of economic contraction in the United States. So there's really no question, but that the U.S. economy has been hit extremely hard by this pandemic and by the shutdown that was required to slow the spread of the virus. That is at odds with the performance of financial markets. I think it's important to remember that financial markets and the stock market is not the same thing as the economy. The stock market isn't wrong per se, or at least it's not obviously wrong or necessarily wrong. The stock market is a forward-looking indicator. The stock market responds to monetary policy and to the interest rate environment that the overall economy is in. So they're just different. And in this case, investors are confident about equity prices and are confident about corporate earnings. At the same time that the U.S. economy is currently experiencing a very, very severe downturn.
But someone told me that the unemployment rate is moving like a rocket ship, Michael. Is the V-shaped recovery on?
Well, the unemployment rate fell in the month of May. That surprised a lot of people. The economy in the U.S. seems to have bottomed out in April. And my expectation was that we would see the economy overall bottom out in April, consumer spending would bottom out in April, and that the labor market would bottom out a month later. The labor market would bottom out in May. Instead, what it looks like is that both consumer spending and the labor market bottomed out in the same month. They both hit their low point in the month of April. So I think what we saw with the release of economic data last week that showed an unexpectedly good performance for the labor market in the month of May is simply that the labor market recovery began a month earlier than many people, including me, had thought. Of course, we were going to recover at some point, and it's really no surprise. The United States began to partially reopen in late April and in May, and so it's not terribly surprising that when the lockdown orders were partially lifted, that a bunch of people went back to work and that consumers spent more money. What is surprising is, I think, the speed with which the labor market began a recovery. But again, we're only talking about a month earlier than I had expected, and that month is important, but the labor market is in for several years of healing, and so in the grand scheme of things, 1 month is not necessarily that big of a deal.
Okay, let's specifically talk shapes, Michael. Is this a V? Is this a W? Is this a bathtub? What does this recovery look like to you?
Well, I guess if you had to assign a shape to it, it would probably be a Nike swoosh. There was a pretty rapid drop down, and then there's going to be a ramp up that's going to take longer. A lot of it depends on how you look at it. This summer, the third quarter of the year, we're going to see in the United States historic rates of GDP growth. The economy is going to grow this summer at annualized rates that are historic, and the fall. The fourth quarter of the year is also going to see really rapid quarterly economic growth. That's great news for American workers, great news for American families, but it's occurring in a context, and the context is the depth of the decline in the second quarter. So when you're in a hole as deep as the U.S. economy was in the second quarter, you can make rapid progress to climb out of that hole. You can make 2 quarters of rapid progress to climb out of that hole. But at the end of the year, the U.S. economy is still going to be in really bad shape. So you're going to have kind of an odd situation where you have 6 months of rapid growth and a rapid recovery. But even at the end of that, in December, we're still going to be in much worse shape than we were in a year earlier, and we're going to have a long path ahead of us to fully recover.
So when this super growth does happen in the third quarter, Michael, is it going to feel to Americans like the economy is growing fast, or is it going to feel like they're still in a deep recession?
I don't know. I mean, it's a great question. And the answer to that question has important political ramifications, of course, because in the United States in November, we're going to have a presidential election where President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden are going to go head to head in our presidential contest. I think both could be happening at the same time. Candidly, we will still have recession level unemployment well into the fall. We'll have recession level unemployment after the election in the winter. At the same time, we will have experienced 6 months, at that point, on election day, we'll have experienced 5 or 6 months of significant progress in the labor market. And so the question is whether or not the change in the economy, in this case, significant improvement, will be more important than the level of economic activity or the level of unemployment, which will be really, really, really bad.
Michael, the conspiracy theorists have gone nuts with these numbers. Now, the BLS knew that they had classification issues, which is why they put an explanation in their report. But my question is, rather than putting an explanation in, why didn't they just change the numbers themselves to get rid of the classification error?
The reason not to change the number is to preserve the integrity of the data. The conspiracy theorists believe that the number was just changed. In order to ensure that the conspiracy theorists are never right, the Bureau of Labor Statistics never does do those sorts of ad hoc changes. They just accept the survey results as given. That's the right thing to do in this circumstance for precisely this reason. It guards them against the accusation that critics are leveling at them. but of course, the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't just say, oh well, these are the data. They're trying to figure out how to make sure that the people who conduct the interviews are conducting the interview in such a way that the classifications are correct. This has been a problem for 3 months in a row, and it's a little surprising that the problem hasn't been fixed yet. But I expect that progress will continue to be made on this front. It's just a difficult situation. Economic statistics and economic surveys are designed for normal economic times. The government employees who administer these surveys every month are used to administering them in normal economic times. It shouldn't be terribly surprising that the tools that we use in normal times to figure out what's happening in the economy don't work perfectly during a pandemic.
Michael Strain, so good to talk to you. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks so much.
It has been inevitable for the last 2 months, ever since his only remaining rival dropped out of the contest. But this week, Joe Biden finally won enough delegates to clinch the Democratic Party's presidential nomination for 2020. Primaries last week, many of which had been delayed by the coronavirus pandemic, saw Biden pass the 1,991 delegates that he'll need to win the nomination on the first ballot at the convention, which itself, of course, has been postponed until August because of the pandemic. The 77-year-old former two-term Veep and 36-year Senate veteran has also consolidated his lead in the national polls over President Trump. Joe Biden leading by 14 points, according to a CNN poll released on Tuesday. The Trump campaign then sent a lawyer's letter to CNN demanding they retract that poll. The president was saying that this is a suppression poll, one that was designed to look as bad as possible to demoralise Trump supporters, so they'll just stay at home. CNN says they are standing by the methodology and the sampling that they used in all of this. It's worth noting, Chaz, that other polls this week have also put Joe Biden 10 points or 11 points ahead. So this isn't a massive outlier, even if it is at the upper end of a margin of error. Also worth noting that at no point in 2016 did Hillary Clinton hit 55% support in any national poll. So this is looking pretty bad for President Trump right now.
Yeah, I should say as well that it's a common complaint that people make when they're doing poorly, to say, oh, there's undersampling of our party, which is what Trump was complaining about. He was saying there weren't enough Republicans there. But usually with polls, that's a sign that you're on the nose and people from your party aren't responding to polls.
Right.
Because they tend to only respond to polls when they're feeling
So when you have surveys that say that 28% of American voters are Republicans, and then you look at the crosstabs of this poll and it says, oh, look, they've only spoken to 25%, but only 25% of respondents are Republicans. Therefore, we're being shortchanged. Well, why is that not a good argument to make?
Well, two things. First of all, depending on the poll, they often wait for the response. So even if they only got 25% Republicans, they might bump it up a little bit, the Republican side, to make sure it matches. But secondly, like I said, that's actually representative. If an election was held now, it's likely that fewer Republicans would show up because they're demoralised. That's why they're not answering the polls.
Or they're calling themselves independents rather than Republicans.
Yes, exactly. So I while it's possible that might, inverted commas, skew the polls a little, that always happens, always. And in the past, when people said, oh, the polls are biased because of that, when the election was held directly after, namely in 2012, it was quite embarrassing to those people who were using those arguments because they were completely wrong.
Yeah, and the same ones are often used as well when they sort of say you're undersampling, white suburban women or working class black males or whatever.
They do try to adjust for that kind of stuff. I can see, though, why Trump wouldn't have liked that CNN poll. Apart from the 14-point lead, which was he wouldn't have liked much, I had a really interesting detail, and it was this. Out of all the people backing Biden in that poll, 60% of them said that they were simply opposed to Trump rather than supporting Biden. Now, after 3.5 years, those people are not coming back to Trump. They're gone if they're that far away from him. So that's pretty bad news. Those people are baked in. That's bad news for Trump. That tells me that Trump's best chance this year is making those people hate Biden more than they hate Trump after 3.5 years of hating on Trump. Now, that's a big ask.
Yep.
He's going to have to get very ugly to have any chance to pull them over.
Just as he had to in 2016 in order to win for the first time. That must be a concern, though, for Biden's supporters, that if you look at the Democratic candidates, or indeed Republican candidates that have knocked off an incumbent president, so George H.W. Bush in 92, Jimmy Carter in 1980, there was a high level of enthusiasm for Bill Clinton in 1992, first baby boomer president, Kennedy-esque. Ronald Reagan in 1980, he was this, former movie star, new conservative, and so on. So seeing the low level of enthusiasm for Biden now, he's the best of a bad lot, that suggests that you're going to have lower turnout, and there are a lot of other factors lowering turnout as well, which would tend to help Donald Trump at the end of the day as well.
Yeah, although that 60%, the anti-Donald Trump factor, they'll generate their own enthusiasm against Trump rather than for Biden.
Yeah, well, it could be. This week, Joe Biden has consolidated an 8-point advantage in the average of national polls. And the president's approval numbers are also taking a dip at the moment, down to 39 points in the Gallup poll. That was the one where President Trump hit 49% 2 months ago, and people were going, my goodness, his approval rating is up. Well, it's now back with a 3 in front of it. Even the president's more favourable Rasmussen poll is down to 43%. He's gotten to 53% approval in that Rasmussen poll. So this is all good news right now for Joe Biden, whose nomination, of course, has come at the third attempt, very late in life. He ran for president unsuccessfully in his 40s in 1988 and in his 60s in 2008. And when you think about it, it's a pretty stunning comeback from those 3 early defeats that Biden suffered in the primaries. There were lots of bumps along the way. It was in April that we were talking about these allegations from his former staffer, Tara Reid, that he had sexually assaulted and harassed her in the early 1990s. Biden denied those claims, and the media's kind of gone cold on the story because they haven't been able to corroborate it beyond the fact that she did share her version of that story for literally decades with neighbours and her ex-husband and so on. But they've kind of, I don't know, after her lawyer walked away from her in May, it seems the media is also just going quiet on that one.
Yeah. I should say, by the way, when you're talking about people writing off Biden, we both wrote him off big time last year.
Yeah.
Over and over and over again.
Yeah, no, it's true. And
it's an ugly montage.
Yeah. We should dig that out.
No, let's not.
That'll make us humble. Former Republican Secretary of State Colin Powell announced this week that he would be supporting Joe Biden for president. And Colin Powell also very scathing in his criticisms of President Trump. Take a look.
And the one word I have to use with respect to what he's been doing for the last several years is a word I would never have used before. I never would have used with any of the 4 presidents I've worked for. He lies. He lies about things. And he gets away with it because people will not hold him accountable.
Now, to be fair, Colin Powell hasn't voted Republican since 2004.
Yeah, that's true.
He's a Democrat now.
Well, yes. He made an exception for Barack Obama.
And then
for Hillary Clinton. Yeah, it's true. But speaking of Republicans who are coming out, or maybe not coming out against President Trump, there was a New York Times report this week that had George W. Bush saying that he would not be voting for Trump. Well, that has been rejected by Bush spokesman Freddie Ford, who says that the story is completely made up and that George W. Bush has retired from presidential politics and has not indicated how he will vote. Although that is not actually an endorsement of Donald Trump, just saying, I'm not going to say anything on all of this. But that
he's definitely not going to say anything because Jeb's son, George P.
Yes.
Is that Jeb's son? I think it is.
Yeah.
He's definitely in the Bush family.
Yes.
He's trying to run for office.
Yes.
And getting tweeted at by Trump is not ideal if you want to run for office. So he'll keep mum.
Yeah, although that same report did have Mitt Romney as saying that he will not be voting for Donald Trump this year. Again, not a huge surprise, but Romney has not denied that report. So we can at least take it that Mitt Romney, if not Lisa Murkowski, and who knows about Susan Collins, but there are a few Republicans that are taking a stand against President Trump, but they're still not going for the lifeboats.
No, not yet. And I don't think they will until like if everything goes badly for Trump. And look, there's going to be a comeback. There always is a comeback. There's going to be a comeback. But let's say it all falls apart for Trump. I think even then they wouldn't head for the lifeboats till at least, at the earliest, a month before the election, if not 2 weeks before the election. Because they remember what happened last time. Like, do you remember the pussy grabbing thing? That was what? That was a month out.
Yeah.
And he had no chance then. Everyone was going for lifeboats then, but he came back.
Mike Pence and others, they were talking about replacing Trump as the nominee.
And if they write him off, they know for a fact they will lose big time. They'll all lose their positions then. So they're not going to give up on him unless they absolutely have to. And there is going to be a comeback. The lower down you are in the polls, the easier it is to bounce back up.
Reversion to the mean.
Exactly.
There are some very fundamental structural dynamics that appear to be the case. That I think, we probably will look back on the polls from 12 months ago. The head-to-heads that had Joe Biden winning by 5 points. And he's, that's now gone up to, 8 points in the average of national polls, some of them getting into the mid-teens. But it looks as though there's potentially, a lot can happen in a little under 5 months, but it looks as though there is a pretty baked-in kind of dynamic here.
I think there probably is, but I just can't go past what Michael Strain was saying before. There is going to be possibly 3 or 4 straight months of 2 million jobs per month being created. Even if it is, even if they are still in a massive recession, Trump's going to be able to ride that hard if he wants to, and I'm sure he wants to.
Although those 2 and 3 months could have 50,000 dead Americans from coronavirus each month. So.
Are they getting used to it? There've been 6,000 or 7,000 dying every week for the last month, and we've just about forgotten about it.
It's the new normal.
So we will see about that. Although you are right that things aren't going great for Trump. In particular, the thing which I found interesting from all the polls, like you went through a whole bunch of polls there, but there's one more I want to draw attention to. Even amongst Trump's strongest demographic, whites without a college degree, he currently has 47% approval, which is down from 54% approval last month and down from 66% approval the month before that. He's lost 20% approval from his homebodies. These are the guys who love him more than anything. And so he definitely is having a downswing, but I do think he will come back, I suspect. One thing I just want to just raise, though, about the election, which is, we've talked about this a little bit, but we saw evidence of it this week, which is we've talked about the problems of how people are going to vote during COVID. What's the system going to be when they have new machines to try and deal with Russia and all that kind of stuff?
We got some answers this week.
We saw the trial run in Georgia. Have a look at this. This is the queue in one polling place in Atlanta. Now, they said the problem was there wasn't enough training for the machines, but there's always going to be new machines. There's always going to need training. This is what we might expect in a few months' time. It just goes on and on and on. They need to solve that.
Yep.
Otherwise, leaving aside whether people can vote or not, there's going to be the controversy about is it rigged, is it not rigged? And we really don't need that again.
Yeah, and we're talking about people who get there at 7 a.m. to vote and waiting until after 1 p.m. to cast their vote, only to find that the new touchscreen voting booths are not working. They got 4 and a bit months to sort these problems out. But look, we're right out of time for another Fireside Chat. I hope you can join us for Planet America next Wednesday night on ABC TV at 9:30 p.m. And if you missed this week's program, it's on iView right now. Turn into a double feature. Grab some popcorn.
Perfect. And make it a triple feature because I've got a new pet podcast as well. So see you there.
Bye-bye.